Inside the steel belly of a Panzer, the world was a claustrophobic cage of heat, oily smoke, and frantic commands. For the crews clinging to the Normandy hedgerows, the sound of an approaching aircraft was not just a threat, it was a definitive marker of impending ruin. They learned to live in a state of dual terror. They feared the massive, relentless American Thunderbolts that prowled the skies in heavy metallic swarms, suppressing the ground with a heavy caliber lead that turned every exposed inch of earth into a death trap. But they dreaded the British Typhoons, the agile, shrieking snipers that hunted in the low-level brush, delivering their deadly 60-pound unguided rockets with a surgical, agonizing precision that could crack a Tiger tank like a porcelain egg. One brought an overwhelming, inescapable storm. The other brought the sudden, silent end to a soldier's war. Today, we uncover the shocking truth about US and British battlefield dominance. To understand why these two machines became the nightmares of the Wehrmacht, we must first look at the divergent philosophies of American and British air power. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was in many ways an extension of the United States' industrial might. Designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, it was massive, heavy, and seemingly indestructible. When the U.S. Army Air Forces arrived in the European theater, they possessed an aircraft that could absorb an immense amount of ground fire, a vital quality when flying low over the deadly flak alleys of Normandy. The doctrine was simple: overwhelming force. The Thunderbolt pilot didn't need to be a surgical sniper in every engagement. He had 8.50 caliber machine guns, each firing hundreds of rounds per minute. When a jug, as the pilots affectionately called it, strafed a German convoy, it wasn't just hitting a target, it was saturating an entire area with a wall of lead. The fear it instilled was a relentless, systemic suppression. It was the atmospheric equivalent of a heavy rain that wouldn't stop, designed to pin the enemy in place, break their morale through sheer volume of fire, and clear the path for the Allied ground advance with a mechanical, unstoppable consistency.
Across the Channel, the British approach to tactical air support was forged in the bitter, bloody crucible of the Battle of Britain and the subsequent years of fighting for aerial superiority. The Hawker Typhoon was born from a requirement for a high-performance interceptor, but it found its true calling as a dedicated tank buster. Unlike the American P-47, which leaned on high-altitude toughness, the Typhoon was a low-level brawler. It was designed to fly hard, fly fast, and get under the German radar. By 1944, the Royal Air Force had realized that against the thick frontal armor of a Panther or Tiger, machine guns were often insufficient. They turned to the RP-3, the rocket projectile, a 60-pound explosive head that turned the aircraft into a flying launch platform. The British doctrine was not about atmospheric suppression, it was about the kill. It was a refined, sharp, and deeply personal style of combat. Where the American Thunderbolt pilot flew a heavy, sweeping arc of devastation, the Typhoon pilot flew a precise vertical dive, seeking the vulnerable engine deck or the top turret of a German tank. This fundamental difference in tactical philosophy created two entirely distinct psychological scars on the German soldier, one who feared the sky for the storm it brought, and one who watched the sky for the single, screaming projectile that meant the end of his machine. The German command, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recognized early that their greatest tactical advantage, the concentration of heavy armored reserves, was being systematically neutralized from above. To mitigate this, the Panzer divisions were ordered to move primarily under the cover of night or during periods of heavy cloud cover, effectively turning the European summer into a seasonal game of hide and seek. Yet the Allied air superiority was so pervasive that even the smallest motorized supply column was never truly safe. The German crews lived in a state of perpetual jittery exhaustion. They knew that the Jabos, short for Jagdbomber or fighter bombers, were always listening. They could hear the hum of a radial engine from miles away, a sound that signaled a total suspension of all movement. If a column was caught in the open, the drill was brutal. Evacuate the vehicles, disperse into the bocage, and pray the strike passed by. The tactical reality for a panzer commander in Normandy became a cycle of paralysis and frantic bursts of action. A unit might spend 18 hours sitting perfectly still under camouflage netting, sweating in the stifling heat of a hull, listening to the roar of American Thunderbolts patrolling overhead like hungry hawks. Then, at the first sign of twilight or a break in the weather, they would risk a mad dash forward, only to be ambushed by the lethal pinpoint strikes of a lone Typhoon wing. It was a war of nerves that no amount of training could prepare them for. The sheer psychological pressure of this constant aerial threat meant that a panzer division was often broken not in a direct tank-on-tank battle, but through a slow, agonizing erosion of its will to move. The German soldier learned to view the open sky as an enemy, a vast blue aperture through which death could arrive at any second, either in a thundering rain-like spray of bullets or a single screaming bolt from the heavens.
To understand the difference between these two threats, one must sit in the dirt beside a German soldier during the American hour. When the P-47 Thunderbolt arrived, it didn't arrive alone. It came in massive, patrolling formations, scouring the terrain with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. For a Panzer Grenadier in a half-track, the arrival of the Jug was an audible warning that turned into a visual avalanche. The sound, a deep, rhythmic, heavy-duty thrumming, would grow until it seemed to occupy the very air itself. Then came the strafing run. The P-47s would bank in a wide, sweeping circle, their 8 half-caliber machine guns emitting a singular, terrifying sound, a continuous shredding rip like canvas being torn by a giant's hand. This was not a weapon of precision, it was a weapon of total denial. A single Thunderbolt could rake 100 yards of hedgerow, shredding trees, pulverizing soil, and turning any soft-skinned transport vehicle into a sieve of twisted metal and fire. The psychological impact of the Thunderbolt was rooted in its sheer persistence. It wasn't just trying to destroy a tank, it was trying to destroy the ability of the German army to exist in the daylight. A tanker would watch, helpless from the interior of his turret, listening as the bullets hammered against the hull, a deafening metallic gong show that left ears ringing and crewmen concussed even if the armor held. If you were exposed, you were dead. If you were inside the tank, you were trapped in a vibrating, ringing chamber of hell. The Jug gave you no chance to fight back effectively, but it gave you plenty of time to contemplate your own annihilation. It was the heavy hand of American industry applied directly to the spine of the German defense, a relentless suppression that forced the panzer divisions to trade their mobility for survival. It turned every road in Normandy into a gauntlet of lead, and every panzer crew into a team of frightened men perpetually waiting for the next roar of the radial engine to signal the end of their movement. If the American Thunderbolt was a storm of suppression, the Typhoon was a focused, lethal bolt of singular intent. For the German tank commander, the appearance of a Typhoon wing was not announced by the steady drone of a patrol, but a sudden, ear-splitting shriel, the distinct high-pitched whine of the Napier Sabre engine as it was pushed into a vertical dive. In a heartbeat, the atmosphere shifted from the background hum of war to the immediate frantic anticipation of a sniper's shot. There was no widespread strafing, there was no wall of machine gun fire, there was only the singular focus of the Typhoon pilot and the terrifying trajectory of his load line. When the rockets were released, they emitted a distinct, searing whoosh that soldiers on the ground remembered for the rest of their lives. It was the sound of a predator closing the final distance. The impact of the Typhoon was surgical, and for the tankers, it was profoundly more dreaded than the machine gun fire of the Thunderbolt. You could survive the hail of lead, you could not survive the arrival of a 60-pound rocket. A Panzer commander would watch as the Typhoon dived, his own crew firing desperately with anti-aircraft cannons, only to see the rocket streak down with horrifying, unswerving speed. When it hit, it didn't just mark the tank, it erased it. The rocket didn't care about armor thickness. It used kinetic energy and concentrated high explosives to tear open the hull, often cooking the ammunition inside in a single catastrophic instant. The Typhoon turned the Panzer from a mobile fortress into a burning tomb. This was the terror of the hunter-killer. The knowledge that even if you were perfectly camouflaged, even if you were moving at speed, you could be singled out and destroyed in a single breathless second. The German crewman didn't fear the Jug because of the sheer volume of its violence. He feared the Typhoon because he knew it was looking for him, and he knew that when it found him, he wouldn't just be suppressed, he would cease to exist.
The cumulative effect of this dual-threat environment forced an irrevocable shift in German tactical doctrine. By late July 1944, the Panzer divisions were no longer functioning as the mobile, aggressive reserves they were meant to be. They had been degraded into static, highly vulnerable entities, forced to hide during the day and move only in short, frantic bursts at twilight. The Allied High Command, recognizing the effectiveness of this atmospheric strangulation, began to refine the coordination between their two distinct aerial assets. They moved toward a more integrated model, where the P-47s would establish the initial layer of suppression, pinning the German armor in the dense cover of the bocage, while the Typhoons acted as the agile, high-accuracy finishers, hunting for specific, high-value armored targets identified by ground observers and forward air controllers. This was not mere cooperation. It was the birth of true, multi-layered close air support. The German military was suddenly facing an enemy that had realized that a tank could be defeated without ever being fired upon by another tank. As this tactical partnership matured, it began to dictate the entire flow of the Battle of Normandy. The Luftwaffe, already depleted and struggling to maintain its own defensive integrity, was essentially absent from the skies above the hedgerows, leaving the German ground forces without any meaningful canopy to operate under. Every German movement became a high-risk operation, and every Allied air patrol became a potential death sentence. The operational reality of the Panzer commander had been transformed. The tank, once the king of the battlefield, had become the primary target of a total war aerial apparatus that combined American volume and British precision. It was a brutal realization that the environment itself had been re-engineered to be hostile to the very existence of the German heavy-armored division, signaling a definitive end of the era of mechanized breakthroughs in the West. The synergy of Allied tactical air power reached its terrifying terminal zenith in the Falaise Pocket during the middle of August 1944. As the remnants of the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army attempted a desperate retreat through a shrinking gap, they encountered the Highway of Death, a slaughterhouse where the P-47 and the Typhoon functioned in perfect, murderous harmony. The American Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force scoured the perimeter, using their massive volume of .50 caliber fire to shred the soft-skinned supply trucks and fuel bowsers that formed the vital arteries of the retreat. They targeted the bridges and the narrow crossroads, creating massive, smoldering traffic jams that paralyzed the German columns. Once the movement was frozen, the Typhoons of the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force descended like precision scalpels. They flew into the smoke-choked valleys at treetop level, their RP-3 rockets seeking out the panzers trapped in the gridlock. The result was a logistical and human catastrophe that Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister of Armaments, later described as the moment the German army in the West truly ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force.
This operational shift fundamentally altered the psychology of armored warfare forever. The German tanker had been forced to accept a new, humiliating reality. His heavy armor, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was no longer his shield, but his tomb. The Typhoon terror became so pervasive that German crews began to abandon perfectly functional Panther and Tiger tanks at the first sound of a Napier Sabre engine, choosing the uncertainty of the hedgerows over the near certainty of being incinerated inside their steel hulls. Logistics had been weaponized from the air. The P-47 destroyed the system that allowed the tank to run, while the Typhoon destroyed the hardware itself. The Allied victory in Normandy was not won solely by the bravery of the infantry or the weight of their own tanks, but by the mastery of a new vertical dimension of combat. By late 1944, the Panzer Division was an endangered species, hunted day and night by an aerial partnership that had turned the very atmosphere of Europe into a cage from which there was no tactical escape. Looking back from the vantage point of history, the duel between the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Hawker Typhoon is more than just a case study in aerial tactics. It is a profound testament to the power of synergy. The American juggernaut with its relentless industrial-scale pressure, and the British scalpel with its focused, lethal precision created an aerial environment that was, for the Wehrmacht, completely inescapable. They were two different solutions to the same problem: how to nullify the armored spearhead of a modern industrial army. Yet their true effectiveness lay not in their individuality, but in their combination. They forced the enemy to defend against the storm and the bolt simultaneously, a defensive task that proved impossible to sustain. In the end, the story of these two machines is a reminder that the wars of the 20th century were not won just through the courage of the individual soldier on the ground, but through the seamless integration of technology and doctrine. The P-47 and the Typhoon represent a unique moment where the tools of war were perfectly matched to the demands of a volatile, shifting battlefield. They changed the character of combat, turning the open sky into a primary combat zone and forever stripping the heavy tank of its invincibility. As we reflect on these events, we are reminded that in the theater of history, victory often belongs to those who best understand how to use the sky itself as a weapon. A lesson that continues to echo through the skies of the world long after the smoke of Normandy has settled into the quiet, green earth.